The hum of the fluorescent lights in the diner was a constant, lonely buzz, a sound that had become the soundtrack to my life. It was 3 in the morning, and the rain was lashing against the windows, turning the neon sign into a blurry watercolor of red and blue. I wiped down the counter for the 10th time, the smell of stale coffee and grease clinging to my uniform like a second skin. My thoughts were a familiar, dreary loop. The stack of final notices on my kitchen table, the crushing weight of my mother's medical bills, a debt so large it felt like a ghost sitting on my chest. I felt invisible, a worn-out cog in a machine that didn't care if I was there or not. My reflection in the polished chrome of the coffee machine showed a tired, 28-year-old woman with shadows under her eyes that had nothing to do with the dim lighting. That's when the sound shattered the quiet. A heavy, violent bang on the alley door, not a knock for a late delivery, but something desperate and final. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, frantic drum against the steady rhythm of the rain, as a primal fear told me that whatever was on the other side of that door was the end of my world as I knew it. My hand trembled as I unlocked the deadbolt, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, to pretend I hadn't heard a thing. But another part of me, the part that was too tired to be afraid of anything more than the slow death of my current life, forced me to turn the handle. The door swung inward with a groan, revealing a scene straight from a nightmare. A man was slumped against the rain-slicked brick wall, his tailored suit soaked through and stained with a dark, spreading patch of crimson on his side. He was tall and broad, with an aura of power that even pain couldn't diminish. But it wasn't him that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the little girl clutched in his arms, her face buried in his chest, her tiny body shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't have been more than 6. The man's eyes, dark and intense, met mine. They weren't pleading. They were assessing, commanding. "Please," he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly sound that was both a request and an order. "She needs to be safe. They can't find her." In that moment, the mountain of debt, the lonely nights, it all faded away. There was only a wounded man and a terrified child in a dark alley, and I knew I couldn't just close the door. Looking back, I realized that single moment was a hinge on which my entire life swung open. One choice, one act of compassion in a dark alley, and nothing was ever the same again. It's funny how the biggest decisions we make don't feel big at all at the time. They just feel necessary. If you've ever felt that pull, that instinct to step in when the world tells you to step away, then you know what I'm talking about. My story is about what happens after you open that door. If you're already feeling that knot in your stomach, that curiosity about the man in the suit and the silent little girl, I hope you'll join me for the whole journey. Take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because their world was about to crash head first into mine, and the wreckage would change everything. And please, leave a like and a comment below. Knowing you're listening makes telling this story feel a little less lonely. It's a story about finding family in the most broken of places. And I have a feeling some of you know exactly what that's like. Now, let me tell you what happened when I brought the storm inside. I didn't even think about calling the police or an ambulance. Something in his eyes, a hard, dangerous glint, told me that would be a death sentence for all of us. Instead, I ushered them through the kitchen, the scent of bleach and old onions a strange contrast to the smell of rain and blood that clung to them. I led them up the rickety stairs to my tiny apartment, my own small sanctuary above the diner. The space was cluttered but clean, filled with secondhand books and a single wilting plant on the windowsill. It was my whole world, and now it was a hiding place for a man who looked like he owned the city and a child who looked like she'd lost everything. He sank onto my worn-out sofa, his breath hissing through his teeth as he carefully settled the little girl beside him. She never let go of his coat, her knuckles white. I grabbed my mother's old first aid kit, the one I hadn't opened since she passed. My hands weren't shaking anymore. There was a strange calm settling over me, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. "You need to take off your jacket," I said, my voice steadier than I felt as I knelt in front of him with antiseptic and gauze. He watched me with an unnerving stillness as I worked, his gaze so intense it felt like he was cataloging every detail of my face, my apartment, my life. I carefully cut away the fabric of his expensive shirt, revealing a nasty bleeding wound just above his hip. It looked clean, like a bullet had passed straight through. My stomach churned, but I focused on cleaning the area, my movements practiced and gentle from years of caring for my mom. All the while, the little girl, Lily, watched me with huge, dark eyes that held an ocean of silent terror. I tried to give her a small, reassuring smile, but she just shrank closer to her father. I warmed some milk on the stove and found the old, threadbare teddy bear I'd kept since I was a child. I offered it to her without a word. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Then, slowly, her small hand reached out and her fingers curled around the bear's worn ear. The man's shoulders relaxed by a fraction of an inch. "Thank you," he said, the two words holding more weight than 1,000 promises. I must have drifted off in the armchair, exhaustion finally claiming me. The first gray light of dawn was filtering through the blinds when I woke with a start. He was standing by the window, looking down at the street below where the city was slowly coming to life. He was still injured, still in my tiny apartment, but the vulnerability of the night was gone. In its place was a chilling aura of command, of contained power that made the small room feel even smaller. He had my mother's quilt draped carefully over Lily, who was still asleep on the sofa, clutching the teddy bear to her chest. He turned from the window, his face a mask of cold calculation. The wounded man from the alley was gone, replaced by someone far more formidable, someone who understood the violence of the world because he was a part of it. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken danger. I could feel my old life, the one of monotonous shifts and crushing debt, slipping away with every tick of the clock on the wall. It was a life I hated, but it was predictable. This man, this silence, was anything but. "My name is Marco Bellini," he stated, his voice calm and devoid of emotion. The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it implied it should. "By bringing us in here, you saved my daughter's life. You also destroyed your own." He didn't say it with malice, but as a simple, undeniable fact, like announcing the weather. The men who did this to me will not stop looking. They know I was in this area. They will soon know about this diner and about the waitress who works the night shift. They will find you. My blood ran cold. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I can't undo what's been done, but I can offer you a choice. I see the bills on your table, the exhaustion in your eyes. I know what it is to be trapped." He paused, his gaze dropping to his sleeping daughter. "Lily hasn't spoken a word since her mother died a year ago. Last night, you were the first person she has responded to. I will erase every dollar of your debt. I will give you a life you cannot imagine. In return, you will come with us. You will stay with Lily, be her anchor, her safe place, until I have eliminated the threat." It wasn't a proposal, it was a declaration. My world had just been burned to the ground, and he was the only one offering a way out of the ashes. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended disbelief, a ghost in my own life. Marco and Lily had vanished as silently as they had appeared, leaving behind only a neatly folded quilt on my sofa and the faint metallic scent of blood I couldn't seem to scrub from the floorboards. I went to work, my movements automatic, the familiar clatter of plates and the drone of the coffee machine feeling alien and distant. Every time the bell above the diner door chimed, my heart would leap into my throat, expecting to see men in dark suits, men with cold eyes like the ones Marco had warned me about. But the only people who came in were the usual late-night truckers and weary travelers, their faces oblivious to the storm that had passed through my world. I told myself it was a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and debt. but the memory of Lily's small hand clutching my old teddy bear was too real, too sharp. Marco's words echoed in my mind, a chilling premonition I tried desperately to ignore. You also destroyed your own. I clung to the monotonous routine of my life, hoping its very dullness would be a shield against the impossible truth. The shield shattered on the third day. My boss, Mr. Henderson, a man whose personality was as greasy as the bacon he served, called me into his cramped office. He didn't ask me to sit, he just pointed a sausage-like finger at the door. "You're fired, Elena," he said, his voice flat and devoid of sympathy. I was stunned, speechless. I asked him why, my mind racing through 100 possible infractions, none of which made sense. He just sneered, a cruel little twist of his lips. "I don't need a reason, but let's just say I don't like trouble, and you smell like trouble. Found a little spot of blood near the back door the other day. I run a clean establishment." He wasn't asking, he was accusing. He saw me not as a loyal employee who had worked double shifts for 2 years without complaint, but as a liability, a piece of trash to be disposed of. In that moment, Marco's prophecy became terrifyingly real. My world wasn't just threatened, it was actively unraveling, thread by thread, and the first anchor that held me to a semblance of normalcy had just been cut loose without a second thought. Losing my job was like pulling one stone from the bottom of a carefully balanced tower of cards. The very next day, a bright pink eviction notice was taped to my apartment door, its official lettering screaming a failure I felt deep in my bones. My landlord, who had always been so friendly when I paid on time, was suddenly a cold, impersonal voice on the phone, citing clauses in my lease and making it clear that my financial problems were not his concern. The stack of bills on my kitchen table no longer felt like a passive weight. They felt like active antagonists, paper soldiers in a war I was losing on all fronts. Desperation began to set in, a cold, cloying fog that seeped into every corner of my tiny apartment. It was in this state of mind that my ex-boyfriend Rick decided to reappear. He'd heard through the grapevine I was out of a job and saw it as an opportunity, showing up with a smirk and a half-hearted offer to help me out, a phrase that had always come with strings attached that felt more like chains. His presence was a vile reminder of a past I thought I had escaped, another vulture circling what it perceived as a dying animal. The final blow came not from Rick, but from a man named Sal, a debt collector for my mother's hospital bills. He was different from the polite but firm voices on the phone. He was a physical presence of intimidation, a thick-necked man with predatory eyes who cornered me in the hallway outside my apartment. He didn't shout, he spoke in a low, menacing tone that was far more terrifying. "The time for polite phone calls is over, sweetheart," he hissed, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes. He braced his arm against the wall, blocking my path, his body radiating a casual threat that made my skin crawl. People who don't pay their debts find that other things get taken as collateral. "You're a pretty girl. I'm sure we can work out some kind of payment plan." The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot wave of shame and fury that left me paralyzed. This was the bottom. I was completely alone, utterly powerless, and the world was no longer just indifferent to my suffering. It was actively closing in to feast on the remains. It was in that moment of absolute despair that the sleek black sedan glided to a silent stop at the curb. The back door opened and Marco Bellini stepped out. He wasn't the wounded, desperate man from my alley. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit, his movements fluid and precise, radiating an aura of such immense power that the grimy street corner seemed to bend around him. Sal, the debt collector, froze mid-sentence, his bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. Another man, lean and watchful, emerged from the driver's side, Leo, I would later learn, his eyes scanning the area with the detached efficiency of a predator. Marco's gaze landed on Sal's hand, braced against the wall next to my head, and then it lifted to meet mine. His face was a mask of cold granite, but his eyes held a flicker of something that looked like contained fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence that fell was more terrifying than any shout. He took a single, deliberate step forward, and Sal, who had seemed so large and menacing just seconds before, visibly shrank. The power dynamic had shifted so completely, so instantaneously, it felt like the laws of physics had been rewritten right there on the sidewalk. My terror hadn't vanished, but it had changed its target. Marco never looked at me again. His entire focus was on the debt collector, who was now stammering, trying to explain his presence. Marco simply raised a hand, silencing him. "You put your hands near her," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that was barely audible but carried the weight of a death sentence. "You threatened her." It wasn't a question. Leo moved with startling speed, grabbing Sal by the collar and slamming him against the brick wall of my building. There was a sickening crunch, a muffled cry of pain, and then Leo was whispering something in Sal's ear, his words too quiet for me to hear, but their effect was immediate. Sal's face went white with a terror so profound it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. Marco watched, his expression unchanging, a judge overseeing a sentence already passed. When Leo finally released him, Sal scrambled away, tripping over his own feet, not even daring to look back. Marco then turned his attention back to me, his gaze sweeping over the eviction notice on my door, my frayed coat, the fear that was still plain on his face. "He told me everything," Leo said quietly, holding up my file. "The job, the eviction, everything." We sat in the back of his car, the leather seats cool against my skin, the scent of expensive cologne and something metallic, like steel, filling the air. The city slid by outside the tinted windows, a world I no longer belonged to. Marco didn't speak for a long time. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. "I told you your life was destroyed," he said finally, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of something I couldn't name. Regret, perhaps, or grim satisfaction. He leaned forward slightly, the intensity in his eyes pinning me in place. "Lily asks for you. She hasn't spoken, but she points to the bear you gave her and then points to the door. She is waiting for you to walk through it." My breath hitched. He was using his daughter, and he knew it. "I will not make you a proposal, Elena. I will state the facts. Your old life is over. The men who hunt me will not stop, and the vermin of this city now see you as prey. I am offering you the only sanctuary that exists. You will come and live in my home. You will care for Lily. In return, every debt you have will be erased. You will want for nothing. Your safety will be absolute." My first instinct was to recoil, to lash out. A bitter, hysterical laugh almost escaped my lips. "My safety? In the home of a man who gets shot in alleys? You call that safety?" My voice trembled with a rage born of fear and helplessness. "What you're offering isn't a sanctuary, it's a cage. A prettier cage than this one, I'll grant you that, but a cage all the same. I'm not some stray you can just pick up off the street and put on a leash, Mr. Bellini. I've taken care of myself my entire life. I don't need your money, and I certainly don't want your protection if it means becoming your property." The words tumbled out, a torrent of wounded pride and defiance. I was lashing out at the only person offering a hand, because his hand was covered in blood. I couldn't bear the thought of being so completely beholden to him, of trading one kind of debt for another, far more dangerous one. The idea of being kept, of being a possession, was a humiliation worse than any threat Sal could have made. I looked him straight in the eye, trying to project a strength I didn't feel. I'd rather take my chances with the scavengers. Marco listened to my outburst without interruption, his expression unchanging. When I was finished, breathing heavily, he didn't argue or try to persuade me. He simply reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. He swiped the screen and turned it to face me. It was a short video clip, clearly from a security camera. It showed a small, sterile-looking playroom filled with expensive toys that were all perfectly in their place. Lily was sitting in the middle of the floor, alone, She wasn't playing. She was just holding the threadbare teddy bear I had given her, rocking back and forth in a slow, rhythmic motion, her eyes wide and vacant, fixed on nothing. The silence in the video was deafening. It was the image of a child completely lost in her own trauma, clinging to the one small piece of comfort she had. He didn't need to say anything. The choice was never really about me. It wasn't about my pride or my fear or my independence. It was about that little girl in the video. My defiance crumbled, replaced by a wave of aching compassion that was stronger than any fear. I closed my eyes. The image of Lily burned into my mind. "Okay," I whispered, the single word a surrender and a vow. "I'll do it. For her." Marco Bellini's penthouse was less a home and more a monument to isolation. It was a sprawling space of glass, chrome, and cold white marble that seemed to suck the warmth out of the air. When Leo, Marco's grim-faced shadow, escorted me inside, my single duffel bag looked pathetic and out of place against the backdrop of minimalist furniture and priceless impersonal art. He laid out the rules with the detached precision of a drill sergeant. I was not to leave the designated living areas, I was not to use any personal electronics, and I was to report any unusual sounds directly to him. I was a guest, a patient, a prisoner. The words swam in my head as I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at a city that now felt 1,000,000 miles away. I felt a surge of panic, the cold reality of my cage finally setting in. Then a tiny hand slipped into mine. Lily was standing beside me, her dark eyes looking up at me with a silent, desperate plea. She squeezed my fingers, her small gesture a fragile anchor in the vast, cold emptiness of my new life. In that moment, I knew I wasn't just a prisoner. I was her protector, and that would have to be enough. My attempts to bring a semblance of normalcy to the sterile environment were met with quiet resistance. The kitchen was a chef's dream, but it felt more like a laboratory, and my simple desire to bake cookies for Lily was treated like a potential security breach. Leo watched my every move as I measured flour, his posture radiating suspicion. The clash came when I tried to alter Lily's rigid minute-by-minute schedule. "She needs to play," I told Marco one evening after finding Lily staring blankly at a television screen programmed with educational content. "She needs to get messy and laugh and just be a little girl, not a soldier in training." He looked at me from across the vast living room, his face an unreadable mask. "Routine is predictability, Elena," he said, his voice a low, even tone that held no room for argument. "Her laughter is a luxury I cannot currently afford." The words were cold, pragmatic, and yet I saw a flicker of profound pain in his eyes. He wasn't a monster. He was a man so terrified of loss that he was suffocating the very person he was trying to protect. Sleep became a stranger. The silence of the penthouse was somehow louder than the constant hum of the diner, filled with the ghosts of my old life and the specter of my new one. One night, unable to bear the quiet any longer, I found myself wandering the darkened halls. A sliver of light drew me to Marco's office. He was standing by his desk, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring at a framed photograph. I couldn't see the image, but the look on his face was one of such profound, unguarded grief that it stole my breath. He must have sensed my presence, because he turned, his eyes instantly shuttered, the mask of control snapping back into place. I expected anger, a sharp reprimand for my intrusion, but he simply gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "You should not wander," he said, his voice rough, "but I suspect sleep is as much a stranger to you as it is to me." He said nothing more, and we sat in a shared, heavy silence, two lonely people in a fortress built of secrets and sorrow. It was the first time I felt like he saw me, not as a function, but as a person who was just as lost as he was. The fragile peace of our silent coexistence was shattered a few days later. I was in the living room with Lily, trying to teach her a simple card game, when Leo entered, his face grim. He spoke to Marco in a low, urgent Italian I couldn't understand, but one name cut through the air like a razor: Victor Sokolov. The name meant nothing to me, but the effect it had on Marco was instantaneous. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees, a chilling aura of lethal stillness descending upon him. He dismissed Leo with a sharp nod and spent the rest of the day on the phone, his voice a low, menacing whisper that promised violence. That evening, new security measures were implemented. Heavy, automated blackout shades now covered the panoramic windows, plunging the penthouse into a perpetual twilight and severing our last visual link to the outside world. I felt the walls of my gilded cage pressing in, suffocating me. When I finally gathered the courage to ask him what was wrong, his reply was swift and final: "The less you know, the safer you are." His words were meant to protect me, but they only made me feel more like a pawn in a game whose rules I would never understand. In the midst of the escalating tension, my small world shrank until it contained only Lily. I poured all my energy into creating a bubble of warmth and safety for her within the cold, shadowed fortress. We built forts out of expensive silk cushions, had picnics on the marble floor, and I would hum the lullabies my mother used to sing to me, my voice a quiet thread of continuity to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. One afternoon, as I was braiding her dark, silky hair, she leaned back against me and let out a soft, contented sigh. It was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. I looked up and saw Marco standing in the doorway, watching us. He wasn't the cold Mafia boss or the grieving husband. For a fleeting second, he was just a father, his eyes filled with a raw, aching gratitude that made my heart clench. He didn't speak, but a silent understanding passed between us. I was no longer just a necessity or a security risk. I was the one who had brought a flicker of light back into his daughter's world, and in doing so, I had unknowingly become essential to his. The danger Marco was trying to keep at bay soon began to circle closer, drawn to me like a shark to blood. Leo delivered the news with his usual stoic grimness, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of weakness. "Word is out," he told Marco, though he was looking directly at me. "Victor's people are asking about the waitress. They want to know who you are, what you are to the boss." The implication was clear. I was no longer an invisible woman hiding in a penthouse. I was a name, a face, a target. I was Marco's new vulnerability. That night, I overheard him on the phone again, but this time the quiet menace was gone, replaced by a raw, unrestrained fury. "If one of your men so much as breathes in her direction," he snarled into the receiver, "I will burn your entire organization to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. She is not part of this. She is off limits." The sheer, terrifying violence in his voice should have sent me running, but a strange, shameful part of me felt a profound sense of security. He was a dangerous man, but his danger was now a shield wrapped protectively around me. The illusion that Marco's shield was impenetrable was shattered with the arrival of a simple, innocuous-looking cardboard box. It was delivered with a routine grocery order, and Leo's men cleared it through security without a second thought. But I recognized the sloppy handwriting on the label instantly. It was addressed to Marco, but it was from my old life. My blood ran cold. Leo snatched it before I could, his instinct screaming that something was wrong. He opened it carefully in the other room, but I already knew. A few minutes later, he returned, his face ashen. In his hand was the small, wilting succulent that had sat on my apartment windowsill, its leaves now brown and dead. Tucked into the dry soil was a small, folded piece of paper. Leo unfolded it and read the single typed sentence aloud, his voice flat. "A pretty flower needs a better garden. We know where you are." They hadn't just found me, they were taunting me. using the remnants of my lonely, simple life as a psychological weapon, proving that no wall was high enough to keep my past from crawling back in to haunt me. That dead plant broke something inside me. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over into a hot, reckless rage. I stormed into Marco's office, the dead plant clutched in my hand, and slammed it down on his desk. "This," I shouted, my voice shaking, "this is what your absolute safety looks like. You promised me I would be protected, but you've just made me a bigger target." "They're playing with me, Marco, using pieces of my life to terrorize me, and you're so busy fighting your war that you didn't even see it coming." For the first time, his icy composure cracked. He stood up, his own fury mirroring mine, and grabbed my arm. His grip was like steel. "Do you think I don't know that?" he bit out, his face inches from mine, his eyes blazing with a terrifying mix of anger and fear. "Every second of every day, I am aware that your presence here puts you in the crosshairs. You are not a liability, Elena. You are the one thing I cannot afford to lose." The words hung in the air between us, a raw, unintentional confession that had nothing to do with Lily and everything to do with me. The final illusion of safety was destroyed not by a package, but by a voice. The penthouse had a dedicated, secure internal phone system, a line Leo assured me was untraceable and impossible to breach. It rang late one night, its chimes startlingly loud in the quiet apartment. Thinking it was Leo with a late-night update for Marco, I answered it without hesitation. "Hello?" I said softly. For a moment, there was only static, and then a distorted electronic voice whispered my name. "Elena." My heart stopped. It was a voice that sounded like grinding metal, cold and devoid of humanity. "You took such good care of your mother," the voice rasped, the words slithering into my ear like poison. "She fought so hard at the end. It's a shame you won't get the same chance." I dropped the receiver as if it had burned me, a strangled cry escaping my lips. The threat was so personal, so deeply violating, it felt like a physical blow. Marco and Leo were there in an instant, their faces a mixture of alarm and confusion. I could only point a trembling finger at the phone. Marco snatched it up, listened to the dead air, and when he looked back at me, the controlled mask was gone completely, replaced by the face of a man who was about to go to war. The false sense of security lasted exactly 72 hours. It was a fragile, temporary piece woven from the simple threads of domesticity I tried to pull into the cold fabric of the penthouse. I was in the kitchen, a space usually reserved for a silent, efficient chef, showing Lily how the flour felt like soft dust between her fingers as we prepared to make simple sugar cookies from a recipe in one of my mother's old cookbooks. For a moment, with Lily's face smudged with flour and a genuine, silent smile on her lips, the chrome and marble fortress almost felt like a home. That's when the first explosion rocked the building. It wasn't close, but it was powerful enough to make the floor-to-ceiling windows shudder violently in their frames. A second, louder blast followed, and the piercing shriek of the building's emergency alarm split the air. Leo was in the room before I could even process what was happening, his gun drawn, his face a grim mask of deadly focus. He grabbed Lily, who had gone rigid with terror, and shoved me toward a seamless panel in the wall. "Move, now." Marco was already there, his own weapon in hand, his eyes scanning the room with a terrifying predatory calm as he herded us into the hidden passage. The heavy steel door of the panic room slid shut behind us, plunging us into a sterile silence and sealing us in a tomb of our own safety. The panic room was a small, windowless cube of brushed steel, equipped with its own air supply, monitors showing dead security feeds, and a cold, unforgiving bench. The silence in here was worse than the alarm, thick with the unsaid and the unknown. Lily had burrowed into my side, her small body trembling uncontrollably, her face hidden against my hip. I wrapped my arms around her, humming the lullaby my mother used to sing, my own heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. Marco paced the small space like a caged panther, his fury a palpable energy that made the air crackle. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stopped, his shoulders slumping in a rare moment of defeat as he looked at his daughter clinging to me. He sank on the bench opposite us, the gun resting heavily on his lap. "When I was 10, he said, his voice a low, rough rasp that seemed torn from his throat, "my father brought a rival to our home for a peace talk. I watched from the stairs as the man pulled a knife. My father, he was faster. I saw what he did to that man. That was the day I learned that home is not a place, it's a fortress, and even fortresses can be breached." I looked at him, seeing not the Mafia boss, but the terrified 10-year-old boy on the stairs, and I understood the prison he had built for himself and for us. Hours bled into one another in that sterile box. Lily eventually cried herself to sleep in my lap, her small face tear-stained and pale. The exhaustion was a heavy blanket, muffling the sharp edges of my fear. Marco hadn't moved from his spot, just watching us with a haunted look in his eyes. I must have shifted because he noticed the long, angry scratch on my forearm where I'd scraped it against the wall in our frantic rush. Without a word, he rose and retrieved a small, clinical first aid kit from a wall compartment. He knelt in front of me, his large, powerful frame seeming to fill the entire room. He took my arm, his touch surprisingly gentle, almost hesitant. As he carefully cleaned the wound with an antiseptic wipe, his focus was so absolute, it felt like the most intimate gesture I had ever experienced. I could feel the warmth of his fingers against my skin, see the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. Our gazes met, and in the charged silence, the world outside, the danger, the very room we were in, all of it melted away. There was only the soft sting of the antiseptic and the undeniable, terrifying pull between two broken people finding a flicker of solace in a shared moment of crisis. He finished, his fingers lingering on my arm for a fraction of a second too long before he abruptly pulled back, the mask of control snapping firmly back into place. Leo's voice crackled through the intercom hours later, declaring the immediate area secure. When the heavy door slid open, the contrast was jarring. The pristine penthouse was now a scene of controlled chaos. Men in dark suits swept for listening devices, while others documented the damage to the lobby downstairs. The attack, Leo explained, had been a diversion, a car bomb in the parking garage, a firefight in the lobby. They hadn't tried to get to our floor, they had just wanted to send a message. And they had left something for us. Leo held up a clear evidence bag. Inside was a small silver locket, tarnished with age. My mother's locket, the one I kept in a jewelry box in my old apartment, the one I thought was safe. They had been in my home. They had walked through my life, touching my memories, tainting them. Marco took the bag from Leo, his knuckles white as he stared at the small piece of silver. A cold, quiet rage emanated from him, more terrifying than any outburst. He turned to me, his dark eyes burning with a chilling promise. "This was a mistake," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "Viktor Sokolov just signed his own death warrant. He wanted to show me he could touch my world. I will burn his to the ground. He will never, ever get near you again." The penthouse was no longer a fortress. It was a target. Within the hour, we were being moved. We left through a service elevator that led to a subterranean tunnel, emerging blocks away into the back of an armored, windowless van. The city I knew, the world I once belonged to, was now just a series of muffled sounds and vibrations through the floor as we drove into the night. Lily was wedged between us, a small, sleeping form that acted as a fragile buffer in the tense, claustrophobic space. I could feel the heat from Marco's body, the rigid set of his shoulders, the coiled energy of a predator ready to strike. After hours on dark, winding roads, we arrived at our new sanctuary. It was a rustic, formidable lodge nestled deep within a thick pine forest, miles from any sign of civilization. The air was cold and clean, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. Inside, it was a paradox of survivalist functionality and Spartan comfort, a stone fireplace, heavy wooden furniture, and windows covered with reinforced steel shutters that blocked out the world. Stripped of his suits and the city, surrounded by the raw, untamed wilderness, Marco seemed to transform. The calculating CEO was gone, replaced by something more primal, more dangerous, and somehow more real. Here, in this isolated refuge, there were no buffers, no staff, no escape from our forced, terrifying proximity. The isolation of the lodge worked its way into our bones, magnifying every unspoken word, every shared glance. The days were quiet, filled with a tense watchfulness, while the nights were long and dark, the silence of the forest pressing in on all sides. One evening, after I had finally gotten Lily to sleep, I found Marco standing by the cold fireplace, staring into the empty hearth, as if he could see ghosts in the ashes. He was holding a small, worn photograph. He didn't try to hide it when he saw me. He simply handed it to me. It was a picture of a beautiful, smiling woman with eyes the same dark shade as Lily's. "Isabella," he said, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw. He then told me the story I had only guessed at, the truth of his pain. She hadn't been sick. She had been with him at a restaurant when a rival crew, Victor's crew, had made a move. She was caught in the crossfire. "She died because she was with me," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. "Because she loved me. My world is poison, Alina. It contaminates everything it touches. I failed to protect her. I will not again." He was confessing his deepest fear, that his love was a weapon aimed at those he held most dear. I didn't say anything. I just sat beside him, a silent witness to his pain, and tentatively took his hand, offering the only comfort I could. I was not afraid. A fragile routine began to form in our wooded prison. I cooked, we read stories to Lily, and Marco taught me the basics of survival, his instructions clipped and impersonal, yet his patience was infinite. One morning, I was humming that old lullaby while washing dishes, the melody a quiet act of defiance against the oppressive silence. Lily was at the large wooden table, meticulously coloring in a book, a rare look of concentration on her face. Marco was nearby, methodically cleaning one of his handguns, the metallic clicks a grim counterpoint to my humming. Suddenly, a deer crashed through the underbrush just outside, the sound of its panicked flight startlingly loud. I jumped, dropping a heavy ceramic bowl. It shattered on the stone floor with a deafening crack. Lily gasped, her crayons falling from her hand, her eyes wide with a familiar, heartbreaking terror. I immediately knelt down, my hands hovering over the sharp pieces. "It's okay, Lilybug," I whispered, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "It was just an accident, see? I'm fine." As I spoke, a sharp shard sliced my palm. A single drop of bright red blood welled up, and Lily's eyes fixed on it. Her face crumpled, her little body tense with worry. Then, a tiny, fragile sound broke a year of silence. "Elena," she whispered, her voice rusty and faint. "Hurt." The world stopped. The sound of Lily's voice, a small, questioning whisper, was a shockwave that decimated the suffocating silence we had lived in for so long. Marco froze, the pieces of the gun in his hands completely forgotten. His head snapped up, his gaze locking first on his daughter, then on me, his face a canvas of stunned disbelief and overwhelming, raw emotion. He was across the room in 3 long strides, but he didn't go to Lily. He came straight to me, kneeling in the wreckage of the broken bowl. He took my hand, his thumb gently wiping away the single drop of blood as he examined the small cut with an intensity that had nothing to do with the wound itself. "She spoke," he breathed, his voice hoarse with awe, his eyes searching mine as if I had performed a miracle. "She spoke for you." The last of his walls crumbled in that moment. He was no longer the boss, the protector, the grieving widower. He was just a man, vulnerable and undone. He lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss against my skin, a silent vow that sealed the unspoken truth between us. Just then, Leo burst through the door, his face ashen, a satellite phone clutched in his hand. "Boss," he choked out, his eyes wide with alarm. "It's Victor. He wants to talk. He said he wants a word with the girl's new mother." Victor's voice, a synthesized rasp slithering through the phone line, was a declaration of war aimed directly at my heart. The words, "the girl's new mother," hung in the air long after Leo had slammed the phone down, a poison that seeped into the very foundation of our fragile sanctuary. The brief, miraculous warmth of hearing Lily's voice, the tentative hope in Marco's eyes, all of it was incinerated in an instant. Marco's face became a mask of cold, controlled fury, a terrifying stillness that was far more frightening than any rage. He didn't look at me, he looked through me, as if I were no longer a person, but a strategic liability, a weakness that had just been publicly announced to his most hated enemy. Leo was already barking orders into a walkie-talkie, his professional calm shattered, revealing a raw, primal fear that mirrored my own. The lodge, which had felt like a refuge, a place where we were starting to heal, suddenly transformed back into a cage. The walls felt thin, the surrounding forest no longer a shield, but a dark, menacing wilderness teeming with unseen threats. I was the reason they were coming. I was the target painted on their backs, and the weight of that knowledge was a physical pressure threatening to crush me. The immediate aftermath was a descent into a cold, calculated paranoia that chilled me to the bone. Marco became a ghost, a silent, brooding presence who spent his days and nights locked in the lodge's small office with Leo, their voices a low, incessant murmur of strategy and suspicion. The trust we had begun to build, that fragile bridge between our 2 broken worlds, crumbled into dust. One afternoon, he emerged from the office, his eyes dark and hollowed out from lack of sleep, and his question felt like a slap. "Tell me about your ex-boyfriend, Rick," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Tell me about your friends from the diner. Who knew you were in debt? Who knew you were alone?" He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was interrogating me, searching for the source of the leak, the traitor who had given Victor my mother's locket. The implication was clear. The weakness had to have come from my life, from my world. Every detail I gave him, every memory of my past, felt like an admission of guilt. He was no longer the man who had gently cleaned my wound. He was the Mafia boss, and I was just another variable in his risk assessment, a potential security breach that had to be analyzed and contained. The truth, when it finally came, was more devastating than any suspicion Marco could have harbored against me. It wasn't my past that had betrayed us, it was his. Leo, his face a grim tableau of fury and disbelief, delivered the news in the main room of the lodge, his voice tight with controlled rage. The traitor was one of Marco's own men, a capo named Antonio, who had been with the Bellini family for over 20 years, a man who held Marco as a child. Victor hadn't bought his loyalty with money. He'd found Antonio's secret, a sick daughter in a private clinic in Switzerland, and had threatened to pull the plug on her life support. The information had been a steady, bleeding wound from the inside, a slow poison that explained everything: the dead plant, the locket, Victor's intimate knowledge of our movements. Marco received the news with a terrifying lack of expression, but I saw the flicker of profound pain in his eyes, the agony of a betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet. The enemy wasn't just outside the gates, he had been sitting at their table all along, proving that in Marco's world, there was no such thing as a safe harbor, not even for him. Marco's reaction to the betrayal was not one of relief or apology toward me, but of violent overcorrection into absolute control. The man who had confessed his grief by the fireplace, who had kissed my hand in awe, vanished completely. In his place was the cold, ruthless strategist, a man convinced that any display of emotion was a fatal weakness. He implemented new protocols that felt less like protection and more like a punishment. An armed guard was stationed outside my bedroom door at all times. My time with Lily was suddenly supervised, our quiet moments of reading and coloring now observed by the cold, watchful eyes of one of Leo's men. Marco argued it was to keep us safe, to eliminate any possibility of another breach, but it felt like he was severing the very connection that had brought us together. He was pushing me away, building a wall of steel and protocol between us, as if my very presence, my warmth, was the contagion he needed to isolate. It was a profound and painful rejection, a clear message that my role was over. I was no longer the emotional anchor. I was simply the asset, the package that had to be secured at all costs, and my heart broke under the weight of his cold, pragmatic protection. The guilt was a relentless tide pulling me under. Every time I looked at Lily's confused, sad face, wondering why I couldn't tuck her in alone anymore, I felt a fresh wave of self-loathing. Victor's words echoed in my head, the girl's new mother. He had branded me, and in doing so, he had made me the single greatest threat to their lives. The internal betrayal, the new suffocating security, Marco's emotional withdrawal, it was all a chain reaction that had started with me. I was the weak link. My simple act of kindness in a dark alley had brought a war to their doorstep. I was the vulnerability that Victor was so masterfully exploiting. I looked at Marco, at the deep, exhausted lines etched into his face, and I saw a man being torn apart by the impossible task of protecting the people he loved from a danger I had invited into his life. The only way to truly save them, the only way to give them a chance at peace, was to remove myself from the equation. If I was gone, Victor would lose his leverage, the target would disappear. The decision settled in my soul with the cold, heavy finality of a tombstone. I had to leave, not to save myself, but to save them from me. My escape was a desperate, silent prayer whispered into the dead of night. I waited until the guard outside my door was a new recruit, his attention more focused on his phone than on his duty. I scribbled a short, tear-stained note, leaving it on my pillow, the words feeling utterly inadequate to convey the love and terror that were driving me away. I am the danger, I wrote. Let me be the one to walk back into the dark. I had no plan, no destination, just the wild animal instinct to run, to dissolve back into the anonymous city where I belonged. I slipped out a small service door in the kitchen, my feet sinking into the cold, damp earth of the forest floor. The darkness was absolute, the trees like silent skeletal sentinels. I hadn't made it 20 yards before a hand clamped down on my arm, the grip like a steel manacle. It was Marco. He had been waiting, as if he had sensed my intent in the very air between us. He dragged me back into the harsh light of the kitchen, his face a mask of cold fury. "Where did you think you were going?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that held no trace of the man I thought I knew. "I'm saving you," I cried, the words torn from my throat, my voice raw with a pain so deep it felt like it was splitting me in two. I tried to explain, to make him understand that my leaving was an act of love, not abandonment. I told him about the guilt, about being his weak point, about how Victor would never stop as long as I was there to be used as a weapon against him. But he didn't hear my words. He only saw the betrayal. He saw me running away, just like he believed his wife had been taken away. Another failure on his part to hold on to the one good thing in his poisoned life. "You think running into the woods like a frightened animal is saving us?" he spat, his voice laced with a cold, cutting contempt that shattered the last of my heart. "You are just like everyone else. When things get hard, you run. You were a mistake." The words were a fatal blow, confirming every single one of my deepest fears and insecurities. He turned away from me, his shoulders rigid. "Leo," he called out, his voice flat and dead. "Take her, find a place, keep her there until this is over." He wouldn't even look at me as Leo gently but firmly led me away. We were over. Everything we had built was a ruin, and I was being exiled, utterly and completely alone. Leo didn't take me to another cold fortress of glass and steel. He drove for hours into the heart of the suburbs, to a small, painfully normal-looking house on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was a prison all the same, just one with floral wallpaper and a manicured lawn. The days that followed were a suffocating fog of grief and regret. Marco's words, "You were a mistake," played on a relentless loop in my mind, each repetition carving a little deeper into my soul. For a time, I allowed the despair to consume me, to believe that I was nothing more than a casualty in his war. But then, looking at my own reflection in the sterile bathroom mirror, I saw the same tired but resilient woman who had opened that alley door. I was not a mistake. I was a fighter. He had retreated into cold, ruthless strategy, and I knew, with a certainty that burned away the fog, that I had to do the same. He was hunting Victor with guns and money. I would have to hunt him with the only weapons I had left, my memory and my wits, proving to him and to myself that I was more than just a liability to be hidden away. While Marco waged his war from a distance, systematically dismantling Victor's shipping routes and turning his financial partners with cold, surgical precision, he was a ghost in his own life. The lodge, once a place of burgeoning hope, now felt cavernous and cold, haunted by my absence. The days that followed were a suffocating fog of grief and regret. Marco's words, "You were a mistake," played on a relentless loop in my mind, each repetition carving a little deeper into my soul. For a time, I allowed the despair to consume me, to believe that I was nothing more than a casualty in his war. But then, looking at my own reflection in the sterile bathroom mirror, I saw the same tired but resilient woman who had opened that alley door. I was not a mistake. I was a fighter. He had retreated into cold, ruthless strategy, and I knew, with a certainty that burned away the fog, that I had to do the same. He was hunting Victor with guns and money. I would have to hunt him with the only weapons I had left, my memory and my wits, proving to him and to myself that I was more than just a liability to be hidden away. While Marco waged his war from a distance, systematically dismantling Victor's shipping routes and turning his financial partners with cold, surgical precision, he was a ghost in his own life. The lodge, once a place of burgeoning hope, now felt cavernous and cold, haunted by my absence. Lily had retreated back into her shell of silence, her dark eyes constantly searching doorways, waiting for me to reappear. Every time he looked at her, Marco was confronted with the brutal consequences of his fear. He had pushed me away not to protect me, but to protect himself from the agony of another loss. And in doing so, he had wounded his daughter and shattered the one connection that had started to heal him. He drove himself and his men with a merciless fury, his grief a tightly controlled inferno fueling his quest for vengeance. Leo watched him, seeing the profound pain beneath the icy exterior, the self-loathing of a man who knew he had broken the one thing he should have protected above all else. The hunt for Victor was no longer about business or honor. It was a desperate, violent penance, a crusade to build a world he no longer believed he deserved to share with me. My new prison was staffed by 2 guards, one a seasoned professional, the other young and easily distracted. It was the younger one, Kevin, who became my focus. I spent days observing their patterns, their shift changes, the way Kevin would scroll through his phone when he thought I was asleep. I feigned a deep, listless depression, playing the part of the broken woman so perfectly that they began to see me as furniture, harmless and defeated. My mind, however, was racing. I kept replaying every snippet of conversation I had ever overheard, searching for a key. The name of the Swiss clinic where Antonio, the traitor, had his sick daughter, that was it. It was a piece of the puzzle Victor wouldn't know I possessed. My chance came on the 3rd night. I created a small kitchen fire, just enough smoke to trigger the alarm and send the guards into a brief, panicked protocol. In the confusion, I slipped into the living room and grabbed Kevin's discarded burner phone from the coffee table. I had seconds. My fingers flew across the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't call Marco. His pride was a wall I couldn't breach. I called Leo. "He's lying to you," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Victor isn't funding Antonio's daughter's care. He's the one who pulled it. I have the clinic's name. Use it." The information was a bombshell. Leo, recognizing the strategic value of what I'd found, immediately related to Marco. It wasn't just intelligence. It was proof that my mind, my presence, was an asset, not a weakness. It gave them a new weapon, a way to break Antonio completely and expose Victor's entire network. But our small victory was short-lived. Victor, realizing his leverage over Antonio was compromised, made a final desperate gambit. He forced the broken capo to make one last call, giving up the location of my safe house. The assault was brutally efficient. The quiet suburban street erupted in chaos. I heard the squeal of tires, the sharp crack of silenced gunfire, and the splintering of the front door. Leo's men fought valiantly, but they were ambushed, outnumbered. Before I could even hide, the fight was over, and a tall, scarred man I knew could only be Victor stood in the doorway, a chilling smile on his lips. He pressed a cold phone to my ear, a call already connected to Marco. "The game is over, Bellini," Victor's voice rasped into the receiver. "I have your queen, the diner, midnight. Come alone, or I'll send her back to you one piece at a time." The diner was a mausoleum, thick with the ghosts of a life that felt a century old. Rain lashed against the windows, the flickering neon sign casting bloody, distorted shadows across the kitchen where I was bound to a chair. Viktor Sokolov paced before me, a monologue of triumph spilling from his lips, a story of how Marco's sentimentality, his fatal flaw in caring for me, had led to his downfall. He savored the moment, confident that Marco would walk through the door alone, a king ready to sacrifice himself for a pawn. But he had fundamentally misread the board. He saw me as a prize, a piece of leverage, not as a player. As he gloated, my mind was sharp, focused. I remembered the loose floor tile near the industrial freezer, the heavy cast iron skillets left on the prep station. I wasn't waiting for a rescue. I was preparing to be part of one. The alley door creaked open, and Marco stepped inside, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, his face a mask of anguish. Victor's smile widened. He had won. He turned his back on me for a single, fatal second to face his true rival. And in that moment, I knew the game wasn't over at all. "You see, he came for you," Victor sneered at Marco, relishing his victory. "Love, it is a cancer." As he spoke, I braced my feet against the leg of the steel table and pushed with every ounce of strength I had. My chair toppled backward with a deafening crash, taking a rack of sheet pans with it. The chaotic noise was the signal. In the split second of distraction, Marco moved, not like a man surrendering, but like a shadow detaching from the wall. The fight was a blur of vicious close-quarters combat, but Victor was a cornered rat, and he was ready. He shoved Marco back and produced a small pistol, its dark metal gleaming under the flickering lights. He didn't aim it at Marco, he aimed it at me. "It always ends this way, Bellini," he screamed, his eyes wild. But my hands, slick with sweat, were finally free of the ropes. Before he could pull the trigger, I scrambled for the nearest weapon I could find, a heavy, half-full canister of flour. I hurled it with a desperate prayer, and it struck his arm, exploding in a choking white cloud. The shot went wild, embedding itself in the ceiling. That was all the time Marco needed. He disarmed Victor with brutal efficiency, and then Leo's men were pouring in from every entrance, a silent, disciplined wave. Marco was at my side, his hands framing my face, his eyes searching mine, filled with a universe of terror, regret, and a love so fierce it stole my breath. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Stay, please, stay with us." And in the wreckage of my old life, I finally found my home. The months that followed were a strange symphony of dismantling and rebuilding. With Victor gone, Marco moved with a cold, surgical precision to cauterize the wounds his rival had inflicted on his organization. He wasn't just a boss, he was a king, reclaiming his territory, but his methods had changed. I sat with him during the long nights in a temporary office, not as a silent observer, but as his counsel, his anchor to a morality beyond simple vengeance. When the question of Antonio, the traitor, came up, Leo argued for a swift, final solution. But Marco looked at me, and I saw the conflict in his eyes. I simply asked, "What would you want someone to do for Lily?" The next day, Antonio was exiled, his life spared, and an anonymous trust was established to continue his daughter's medical care indefinitely. It was a new kind of power, a justice tempered with a mercy I knew came from a place of shared healing. Lily's voice, once a fragile whisper, grew stronger every day, filling the silence in our lives with questions about the world, her laughter a constant, beautiful reminder of what we had fought for. We were slowly, carefully building a new world on the ashes of the old one, a world where strength and kindness could coexist. One afternoon, Marco handed me a set of blueprints. I looked down and saw the familiar layout of the diner, the place where my old life had died and my new one had been born in a baptism of flour and gunfire. He had bought it. "It's a place of bad memories," he said, his voice quiet. "I want to burn it to the ground, but it's also where I found you. It's your history, Elena. You decide what it becomes." And so I did. I didn't want to erase it. I wanted to reclaim it. We spent weeks gutting the old, greasy interior, replacing the cracked linoleum with warm wood, the humming fluorescent lights with soft, glowing pendants. I chose the colors, the menu, the name. It was no longer a lonely stop for weary travelers. It became Lily's, a bright, welcoming place filled with the scent of fresh bread and strong coffee. I hired staff, single mothers, and women who needed a second chance, creating the kind of safe harbor I had always craved. One Saturday, Marco was there with me, a smudge of paint on his cheek, helping me hang a new sign. He wasn't a mafia boss in that moment. He was just a man, my man, helping me build a future out of the broken pieces of my past. We finally found our home, not a penthouse fortress in the sky or a hidden lodge in the woods, but a beautiful stone house on a quiet, tree-lined street with a sprawling backyard. It was secure, of course, with technology so seamless it was invisible, but it was a sanctuary, not a prison. The first thing Marco did was build a swing set, his hands, which I knew were capable of such violence, now carefully assembling the bright red frame. The sound of its creaking chains and Lily's unrestrained laughter became the soundtrack to our new life. I took up sketching again, something I hadn't done since my mother was alive, filling notebooks with the new world around me. Lily chasing butterflies, the way the sunlight fell across Marco's face as he read on the porch. He would often come and stand behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder, a quiet, constant presence that spoke of a peace he had never known. The crushing weight of his past had not vanished, but he no longer carried it alone. He was learning to breathe again, to live in the light, and I realized my greatest strength wasn't just my compassion, but my ability to show him that a safe harbor wasn't a place, but a person. I often think about the woman I was, wiping down counters at 3 in the morning, invisible and drowning in a quiet desperation. It feels like a story about someone else. The scars are still there, a faint white line on my palm from a broken bowl, a deeper one on my heart from the fear and the loss. But they are no longer wounds. They are reminders of my own resilience, of the choices that led me here. Sitting on the porch swing in the warm evening air, with Lily asleep in my lap and Marco's arm wrapped securely around me, I understand that the battle wasn't just against a man named Victor. It was against loneliness, against the belief that we were unworthy of love and safety. We had found our second chance, a family forged in crisis and bound by a fierce, protective love. The world is still a cold and dangerous place, but here, in our small circle of light, we are home. It's a quiet life, a precious life, and telling you all about it reminds me that stories of hope are worth sharing. Thank you for listening. Knowing our story might give someone else a little strength makes the telling that much sweeter.